Welcome to Fossil Creek Tree Farm and Nursery. I'm Max. I'll be your garden coach today, and we're going to be going over fruits, nuts, and berries, which is a lot of stuff. So I'll have to refer to notes, so I brought my eyeballs along. But we have a bunch of things that are possible. So today we're going to be talking about the assortment so you can decide on what you want to do. The fruit trees have a varying degree of participation required of you. Some have very little, and some you've got to be involved. So I'll be going over I'll give a statistical overview to begin with to give you an idea of how much room they take up, how soon you'll get a fruit crop, and how involved you'll have to be. Of course, just to run through them real quick, we can do apples, apricots, blackberries, citrus, with some of these things have conditions, figs, grapes, olives, peaches, pears, persimmons, plums, pomegranates, strawberries, blueberries, and let's see, and of course pecans. Just to narrow your thinking down, I'm going to go over just real quick the amount of space that they take up and the length of time before you're going to get an appreciable crop, and that means a significant harvest, not kind of scattered amount of crop, because a lot of these things will bear some fruit the first year. Typically, you don't want to allow that because you want to have the tree put its energy into getting established rather than producing fruit. So I'll go through the time frame first on the different ones. Apples, 3 to 4 years. Apricots, 5. Blackberries, 2. Citrus, well, they're a container plant, but you'll get some immediately, but it just grows as the plant grows. Figs, 2 to 3. Grapes, 3. Olives, 3 to 4. Peaches, 3. Pears, 4 to 5 years. Persimmons, 4 years. Plums, 2 to 3. Pomegranates, 4. Strawberries, they're immediate. They'll just be bearing March and April, maybe a little bit in May. Blueberries, 4 years, and pecans, 6 to 10 years. And of course, that's qualification on that. These pecans are grafted, so they think they're much older trees than they actually are. That's why they can bear that quickly. When I was a kiddo, I planted a pecan tree in my mom's yard, bare root, and it had 1 pecan the first year. So they're ready to go. It's just they need to grow in an appreciable size before they're going to produce very much. And to go along with that, I'll give you a little range of the amount of space that's required for the different items. Apples, 25 feet, the spacing. If it's a dwarf, it'll be 15. Apricots, 15 to 18. Blackberries will be 3 to 4 feet between the bushes. If you had more than one row, there'd be 8 to 10 feet between rows. And then figs, 15 to 20 feet. You might get by with 10. Grapes, 10 to 20. Olives, say 15 to 25. Peaches, 18 to 25. And we're talking spacing, approximate size on these guys. Pears, 25 to 30. Persimmons, 15 to 25. Plums, 15 to 18. Pomegranates, 10 to 15. Blueberries, 8 to 10 feet between bushes. Pecans, 40 to 50 feet between trees. And of course, the first thing that you're going to have to do once you decide on what you want to plant is the things that are required. Basically, all of these items are full sun. Best to have 8 hours or longer. They can take it all day. Of course, that's how they generate their energy to make their fruit. So all of them are full sun items. Let's see. So, and of course, decent soil helps. We may not have a lot of that around here. Things like pecans, since they make a big tree and they're native to kind of the low areas around rivers and streams, they're adapted to deep soil. So if your soil is 6 inches deep, pecans probably not the thing that you want to attempt. And then good air circulation also helps, kind of cuts down on the pest, dries the foliage. And then also, just as a general rule, keeping the area relatively clean, like old leaves and limbs and debris is best cleaned up and thrown away. And also, typically, mulch is a big plus. Most of these items, they're not friendly. They don't want neighbors, especially things like peach trees. If you have it in your yard, they don't want Bermuda grass growing under them up to their tree trunk. That's competing for nutrients and water. And also, one of the important things is if you have things like that growing up around the trunk, somebody's going to be trimming that grass. They're likely to cause injury to the trunk. So it's best to have typically a 4-foot diameter where it's the soil is bare and you've put mulch on it. Like hardwood mulch is good. Like a 2-inch layer that will insulate the soil from heat and cold. And actually here, heat would be the main concern. Typically we don't get that cold. It doesn't last that long. And since most of these items are deciduous, meaning they lose their leaves and go dormant in the winter, cold is not really a threatening factor. But long, hot summers with the sun bearing down on the soil, they appreciate the roots having some insulation from that high heat. It also conserves moisture, deters weeds, and since that top layer of soil doesn't get to dry out, the mulch keeps that soil surface permeable to where the soil will accept movement of air and water, and when you apply fertilizer, it'll let it, go down into the soil and get to the roots. Let's see. And now I'll go over some of the other requirements. And first of all, I guess we could say we're going to go over a bunch of things that will work. We may as well start out with the things that won't work. Cherries, if you're looking forward to doing those, they're not going to happen here. We don't get enough chilling hours for them. And chilling hours, they're not freezing hours, they're chilling hours, below 45 degrees. And typically here each winter we're around 800 chilling hours. So all of these fruit trees and berries, they can count. So they keep track of how much cool they've gotten when they get up to their required chilling hours, and then the next warm spells that happen, they're underway. That's their sign to get going. So you want to have plants that have a chilling requirement that fits with our locale. Cherries require much more than we'll ever get. If you're really dead set on having cherries, a move to Amarillo would be the biggest help. And then people might say, well, I'd like to have almonds. It's just the opposite. We get too much cold for them. Typically, they will try to get started, and then everything will be wiped out by freezes that are late for them. They want to be in a warmer climate. And then another tree that I didn't mention, loquats. We typically use them here for ornaments. They've got real big, bold foliage, which is a real standout in the landscape. But their fruiting period, they bloom in the fall, probably November. And then if they were going to set fruit, they're going to have fruit through the winter. That's a hit or miss thing here. Typically, I would never tell anybody to expect a fruit crop. Recently, I've had a few customers come in and say, they're getting pretty decent crops from their loquats. That can happen, but, they're lucky, or they have some microclimates that help them out. But typically, that one's not going to do. Let's see. So the varieties that we have here of the different trees, like peaches, we'll have Harvester and Ranger. Harvester has a 750-hour chilling hour requirement. The Ranger's closer to 1,000, but on chilling hours, a lot of things, they'll go 100 hours one way or the other. It doesn't have to be exact. It just can't be, there are some things that have 200 or 250 hours of chilling requirements. They would get that too quickly, and then they would break out with new growth in January, and their blooms would be killed pretty much every year for sure. But the stuff we carry is adapted to the chilling hours that we have here. Let's see. And the other thing that a lot of people are concerned about is, do I have to plant more than one? Will there be a pollinator required? And of course, and the other question is, does it have to be, can it be two of the same thing, or do I need to have two different varieties? It really needs to be two different varieties. And most, and some of almost all of the fruit trees, even that require pollinators, there are a few in there that are self-fruitful. So it's not an absolute. There's a gray area, but and I'll kind of point those out as we go through the varieties. But the things that typically benefit from, and it never hurts to have two varieties. If a peach trees typically, they're self-fruitful. You don't have to have two varieties. But if you do have two varieties, if anything, it's going to help pollination. It's never going to hurt. So it's not a detriment. It can only help. But in things like peaches, it's not required. The things, plants that do need it: apples, pears, blueberries, and helps on pecans. Of course, pecans, they're wind pollinated, so, and we have a fair number of them about, so you could very well plant one pecan and have pecans, because I know in my neighborhood there are pecans all over the place. So that's a, like I say, not a, firm thing that if you don't have two varieties, it's not going to work. But on those, typically we carry Pawnee and Desirable and Choctaw. And Choctaw is a real good pollinator for Pawnee and Desirable. So if you wanted to plant two varieties, it'd be like a Choctaw and a Pawnee or a Desirable. And those are varieties that are adapted to this area. And let's see, blueberries, we have multiple varieties there. Premier is one of the varieties that we carry. It's a good pollinator. So if you plant one Premier, and then you can have your choice. We've also got Climax, and then we have some other varieties here. Let's see. You know, like this is kind of a different one. The pink lemonade, and of course those can go containers. Apples, we've got, and of course this is an example. Granny Smith is self-fruitful, but we also have Honey Crisp and Molly's Delicious. Molly's Delicious is a good pollinator for other apples, and we also have Gala, and Honeycrisp is a good pollinator for Gala. So we kind of got the bases covered on those. On the plums, if you're going to plant one plum, Methley is self-fruitful and is a great pollinator for any of the other plums. We also have Santa Rosa, and that one is also self-fruitful. Let's see. And let's see. Okay. And I'll confirm on the other things, other items when we go through them, that they're not going to need other pollinators. The next thing, that as far as managing your crop, there's a question of, do I need to thin the fruit? And that's pretty important, because things like peaches and plums, especially peaches, and to a degree apples, a little bit on apricots, but they will tend to put on more fruit than they can actually sustain. Sustain in two regards. They will put on so much fruit that the fruit won't get to be as large as you would like, and also they'll put on so much that the tree can't bear the weight, and it can end up breaking the tree down. So you'll want to thin to prevent that, and also to make sure that the fruit that you have on there attains a good size. And of course, like I said, thinning, and we'll refer to it as the number of inches, and that's the number of inches between fruit. And typically, the fruit, they can be on there, but when they're less than marble size, or about that, that's when you can remove them. But you'll have, like on a peach tree, those are 6 to 7 inches between fruit. Apricots be 5 inches. Apples be 6 inches between fruit. Plums 4 to 5 inches, and pears 5 to 7. And of course, and citrus, most of the time it won't require thinning, but if the crop just gets extremely heavy, you may have to do some thinning on that. It's kind of a case-by-case basis. And then the other thing that you'll need to be aware of is the different fruit trees require a different amount of pruning. Peach trees are kind of at the top of the list for pruning. You're going to want to remove 35, maybe even 40% of the branches, year to year down the road, because they bear their fruit on year-old stems. So the growth that it has this year, it will bear fruit on that, but the pruning that you do once the trees, get some age on it, you'll prune it in like mid-February or so, close to when it's about to come out. You don't want to say, I've got nothing to do today at the beginning of January and do it. You want to do it close to when a peach tree is going to be leafing out and getting started, and that's typically going to be you can prune mid-February, and it can kind of be adjusted, some years if we have the winter is canceled. You may do a little earlier. If we have a harder year, it may go a little later, but you'll be taking out 35% of the branches, and the new growth that happens that year, that'll be what bears next year. And let's see. And of course, like I said, peaches are the most pruning required. And of course, what you're shooting for, and initially on peaches and plums and apricots, you're shooting for a bowl shape, branching relatively low and come out at a 45-degree angle, a relatively open center. You're not going to have a central leader. It's going to be one of these things, and that keeps the tree shorter, the fruit accessible, and also pruning easier. So those are the ones that are bowl shaped, peach, plum, and apricot. Apples, they're going to be more of a Christmas tree shape. They don't require that much pruning. Pears, they require very little pruning. In fact, that's probably one of the easier plants in that regard. And then, of course, a note on blackberries. They bear on their growth that started, happened last year. So in the spring, they'll bloom, set fruit. Once you've picked the fruit from those canes, they will never bear again. And in fact, probably not long after you have the fruit picked off of them, they're going to go into decline. You're not doing anything wrong. That's it for them. Probably the time that you see them going into decline, the fruit's been picked and you'll have new shoots coming up. The canes that came out that bore fruit, you're going to cut them off at the ground. And then late spring, early summer, the new canes that are come out, you'll be doing some tip pruning on those to get them to branch, to help them not get quite as tall and put on more branches, to make them more accessible and bear a better crop. And let's see. And let's see, we've covered apples. Let's see. And of course, most of the other fruit that we've got, blueberries aren't going to require much pruning. We've also got pomegranates. They won't require much. And let's see. Persimmons, very little pruning required on those. Pecans are not going to require much. And let's see. And on the back here, we have olive trees. They're very little pruning on those. And then also have fig trees, and those really, you don't need to prune those. They grow into a bushy shape all by themselves. And of course, they are, the one neat thing about fruit is you want your landscape to look full and lush and abundant. Well, not only does the fruit give that appearance, but a lot of these trees provide a real neat appearance with their foliage. Figs are one of my favorite because they have a big cut leaf, so they have a real presence in the landscape, and even if they didn't bear fruit, they would be worth planting. Fruit's just a bonus. They're such a neat appearance. And they're, of course, here recently, like last year, a bunch of figs, the cold weather was too much for them. I know my daughter, she had one that she planted in April, and then when last year when February hit, following the spring, summer, and fall season, I was afraid for it, and first it looked like it was going to kill it back to 3 or 4 feet. It ended up killing it back to the ground. But she planted it from a little, I think it wasn't even necessarily that big. And by the fall, it had 5 or 6 canes. The tallest one was over 6 feet. Last year, killed it back to the ground. And by the following end of summer, it had 9 canes, and they were, the tallest one was 8 feet. So since she had planted it early in the year and it established a great root system, even though it got killed back by that, what we'd call a generational event, it got so cold. It bounced back from that, and in a single season, it went back bigger than it was the year before. So they bounce back, and they're tough plants. So I wouldn't let the threat of something that happens pretty infrequently deter me. And they bear fruit, some fruit, right away. And let's see. And of course, and that the most of the trees, nitrogen is the most important fertilizer for them. You can do it in late spring and then through the summer, and probably August is the cutoff. But trees like figs, they don't require very much fertility. They like to be watered, and for them, having the mulch underneath is really important. It conserves the water and prevents weeds and such bothering them. But also, all they need for fertilizer is you could spread some compost on top of the mulch, and that's enough fertilizer for a fig. If you want something easy, they are it, and basically pest-free. And let's see. Okay. And I'll go through as far as easiness, return on investment, so to speak, for what you put into it. Nobody beats blackberries. They put out a crop soon. It's a pretty good sized crop. They're basically pest-free. Not a whole lot of pruning required. You're just going to cut out the old canes and tip them back. So they're easy. The figs, like I say, those are easy. Pears are one of the low maintenance required items. Olives would be relatively easy, not a whole lot of pest problems on those. But I'll give you let me see here. I'll give you a website, because the things like, as far as I mentioned early on, the participation required of you varies. Well, on peach trees, well, you have to do a lot of pruning. It's only once a year, but you have to do that. And then they've got a number of pests that you need to manage. Plums also. Apples, not as much. Pears, very little. Pecans, there are some things that you'll need to manage. And like I say, figs, very little. Blueberries, very little. Pomegranates, very little. But let me give you a email for the Aggie Horticultural or Texas A&M Department of Horticultural Sciences, because they have handouts for the different fruits. And as far as getting the handouts you go to their website and it has a list of them. Things like peaches, pears, plums, those kinds of things, they have individual handouts for the different fruits. Those are the ones that you'd want to get. Some of the ones on there that are like a collective, a bunch of different stuff together. Some of those are older publications. kind of out of date, but the ones that are on the specific different fruits, those are the most recent. And of course, you bear in mind these are helpful because they'll go over the pests and the timing of what you need to do. They do have sometimes somewhat of a commercial kind of bent to them. They're not all necessarily just absolutely homeowners, but some of them are, and they'll give you the information for managing. And that website is www.aggie-horticulture.tamu.edu, and that will open up all the publications that you could need to manage your crops. And if you go into the bookstore, one of the guys that'll help you out, Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening by Greg Grant. You can see that probably Barnes & Noble. And I think he's 6th or 7th generation on his land, and he's been into horticulture his whole life. And but that'll get you covered on all of the specifics. And now, of course, I didn't mention we also have I mentioned it briefly, citrus trees, and typically these guys here are done in a container. Pretty much every year it's going to get cold enough that they're not going to cope with it. At the very least, they'd really be hurt, and pretty commonly they could be killed. So here they're done in containers, and you protect them, on the nights that they're in danger. The ultimate size of the container, if you had, and you wouldn't go to this immediately, but a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot deep, that would sustain a big plant. In fact, probably 3 years ago, at the Fort Worth Botanical Gardens, they had 2 citrus trees in 24-inch boxes, and I couldn't reach the tops of them. The box was, of course, sitting on the ground, and they were this wide. So you can get a big plant in a container. Of course, the neat thing, this is one of the varieties we carry, Meyer lemon. And the neat thing about these is, of course, you can see that they're blooming now. They'll set fruit. And the neat thing about Meyer lemons is, which is a highly unusual thing for fruit trees, they will continue to bloom after they've set fruit. So they'll have lemons on there that are growing and getting bigger, and you will harvest them in like late fall or early winter. But while that's happening, they'll continue to bloom, which is kind of a super neat feature, because even if they didn't have fruit, the fragrance of their blooms is really tremendous. And of course, we'll have limes also. And then these are blueberries. And of course, we've got different varieties. I mentioned Premier is a really good one, Climax, and then we'll have some other dwarf varieties. But years ago, when we got these in, they were setting fruit here in the nursery, and honestly, I kind of had low expectations for their taste, but they are really good. I can say Premier that's one of the, as a kid I grew up, where we had blueberries, and so I was kind of a harsh judge, and Premier is a great tasting blueberry. And then of course pomegranate's a small one, and of course we've got Fuyu persimmons, which is one of, I think that Greg Grant in his book said Fuyu is his favorite variety. Of course, one of the neat things about these is the fruit ripens in the fall, and then they will lose their leaves, so they have this big colored fruit on bare stems going into the winter. So those are just about as ornamental as it can get. And then, of course, this year too, we have new things all the time. This one is a apricot plum cot. It's crossed between an apricot and a plum. And it can be pollinated with Santa Rosa plum. So that's kind of a neat thing. And of course, we've got a Moore Park apricot, and they can be kind of iffy on how often they make a crop. Um, like out of 5 years, maybe you'll get 2 crops because a lot of times their blooms are frozen. But I had customers come in the last couple of years and say that they get a pretty dependable crop out of theirs. So, but of course the other thing that's neat about Moore or apricots is they make a highly ornamental tree. So they're another one that it's kind of a smaller ornamental tree. Even if they didn't produce fruit, they're a really neat looking tree. And then of course these guys, here's Santa Rosa and here's Methley. And of course these guys, you know, you would be pruning to, for instance, this guy, he's kind of what you don't want to have. And that is, if I can get my pruners out, you have a limb growing into the center of the tree, which, you know, that's where you really want basically open space. So you take that guy out. And apricots, kind of the same thing. You could take some of these guys out of the center. And of course this one already, these guys already have a pretty good shape. The lower limbs, you know, you'd take off and you'd have like 5 limbs that are, you know, giving you the bowl. And let's see. And then of course, it's a Kiefer pear, and they tend to be taller, but you can drop the time required for them to fruit if you can kind of weight down some of the limbs to be a little bit horizontal. That speeds up their fruiting and makes for a neat looking tree. And of course, you've probably all seen pear trees that were espaliered onto a trellis on a wall. You can do that with them also. And let's see. And so I think we've covered everything. Let's see. And also just a note on pruning. If you get some vertical shoots, basically on anything through the season, you might have a limb come out, and this can happen on all kind of fruit trees, and it'll just shoot right vertical through the center of the tree or whatever, just going straight up. All vertical shoots, no matter what kind of fruit tree, you're going to be removing those. And then also the we can see most of the fruit trees are grafted, and this is the graft right here. And of course, on the pecan tree, the graft is right here. Anything in the way of growth that comes up below the graft, you'd prune that off immediately. That's growing up from the rootstock. That's not the named variety plant that you have. The exception to that would be the fig trees, because they're grown from cuttings. So their roots are the same variety as the top of the tree. So that's why when they freeze back to the ground, you can cut the dead off, and whatever comes up, it's the same name variety plant that you planted. So you'll still have a Celeste fig or a brown turkey or whatever. So that's the difference. And I think that'll just about cover us. And I appreciate you guys tuning in out there. We didn't have any attendees today. I think everybody's out there battening down the hatches for what's coming tomorrow. But thanks for looking at us online, and we'll have more next week.